My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator today for the first episode of Inside Data Centers, the podcast from RagingWire. You know, data centers are one of the best kept secrets in the internet. You know, it's going to end today because we're going to open up the world of data centers to our listeners. Today's podcast will talk about the past, present, and future of data centers. Joining me are two people who have been with data centers from the early days, Rich Miller and James Leach. Rich Miller is an industry icon and the founder and editor of the website Data Center Frontier, one of the top news and information sites following data centers. James Leach, vice president at RagingWire, has been around data centers so long he actually worked on the tape drives you see in old sci-fi movies and remembers when computer storage was called DASD. Well, that's a lot of experience. So we're not going to beat around the bush here. We're going to jump right in. So Rich, talked about the history, past of data centers. What's your first memory of being in a data center?
I remember it really well because it was a career-changing day for me. It was in the winter of 2000. I had been working in the newspaper industry for about 18 years and was trying to help newspapers understand the importance of the internet. So I, as an internet user, I immediately saw how important it was going to be for business. My wife and I actually learned to build websites. So I understood the consumer part of it and how people were using it. But I never understood that there was this whole other component to it until I met a guy who worked with data centers and telecom facilities. And he kept telling me, this is really the thing that you should be writing about. He was all excited about data centers, and I just didn't understand it. So he said, look, do this with me. Come see one. And so we went to a small data center outside Princeton, New Jersey. It was operated at the time by a company called Level 3. And I walked into the data center and saw the raised floors, all of the servers, the blinking lights, the storage units. It sort of opened the door on this incredible other world of infrastructure that supported all this. I understood the transformative power of the internet as a user, but then this whole other world was opened up, and it was like the light bulb went off over my head.
Someone pulled back the curtain.
Exactly. And immediately the next thought I had was, they're going to need these everywhere. And so that was really my first data center experience. And within, a few months, I, quit my newspaper job and have been writing about the data center sector pretty much ever since.
Wow, career changing. Well, James, going to hard to top that story. So what was your first experience at a data center?
Well, I actually can go back one more generation before what Rich was discussing, because Rich actually was talking about the emergence of the internet data center in around 2000. But if you go back 10 years before that, the real start of the data center business or data center industry was in the enterprise. And it was in these Fortune 500 enterprises. And it really revolved around the mainframe. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was a part of history. I was living it, and the mainframes were changing the way businesses operated, and basically by taking files, paper files, digitizing them, putting them on these big storage devices, and then having these physically very large computers available to do transactions on them. And the first data centers were basically built to house those mainframe computers. They were purpose-built. Everything that the mainframe needed is what you found in a data center. And almost all the time, they were located in the office building. If the office was located in a major market, then the data center was in a major market. If the office was in a small town somewhere, then you'd find the data center there as well. And it really was those enterprise data centers that then moved in to become internet-based data centers, and then just skyrocketed into what we have today.
I've got some experience in radio, so I can say the phrase that pays. So, Rich, the phrase that pays is co-location. So when did you first heard the word co-location, and how's that impacted kind of the long development of data centers?
So Jim talked about the early days when people would have their computers located in computer rooms or IT closets within office buildings. So computers and servers use a lot of electricity. They throw off a lot of heat. So it was really sort of difficult to operate these within an office environment. So that's where these co-location centers came along. These are facilities that are built specifically for servers and storage. It's like just as houses are built for people to live and eat and sleep in, data centers and co-location facilities are built specifically around the needs for computer servers, with lots of power, lots of cooling, fast network connections so that they can talk to other computers. And co-location really became important after the breakup of the phone system in the 1980s and 90s. Initially, the new competitors for the Bell system were supposed to be able to work with the phone companies to then build their own businesses. So that's where the word co-location came from, is you would co-locate your equipment and servers with the phone company. And what happened was people spent a lot of money on servers and equipment that they would then have to place in under the control, pretty much, of the folks they were trying to compete with. So pretty soon they found the need to have separate, distinct facilities that were completely dedicated to housing this equipment, that weren't owned by their competitors, and really run by people who were completely focused around taking care of this equipment.
And that's when those companies emerged to actually
It was a perfect storm, wasn't it, James? Tell us about your experience with co-location. This perfect storm came, Bell was backing away, and companies filled the void.
Well, I'm a little worried that this might soon start to sound like, I walked 3 miles to school in the snow. But it really was a little bit like that back in those days. And the early companies that people can probably remember if they were around then, were right in the middle of the dot-com boom. Remember the dot-com boom? And there was a big software component to the dot-com boom. There was a big equipment and network equipment component to the dot-com boom. But on the data center side, there were a couple names that most people remember. And one is almost everybody seems to remember is Exodus Communications. And the reason why they remember it is because the stock went way up and then the stock came way down and they filed for bankruptcy. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I remember that stock trading in the 40s or so. And then I remember when bankruptcy came, it was in the low teens of cents, so it was down around 17, 20 cents. The other company people will remember is Equinix. And Equinix is still around and a big player in the data center industry. But some people will remember that back in those old days, times weren't so good. And I still remember living through that. One of the largest reverse stock splits in the history of the data center industry was 32-for-1 with Equinix. And of course, they've long since recovered from that. But back in those times, it was kind of tough going. And then there was my own company, RagingWire. And RagingWire was on a different path. We were privately held, family owned, and always were. And so we didn't experience the highs and lows of the stock market those days, but just kind of slow and steady growth, primarily in California, designing and building data centers and then running them. And that's where we became part of the early days of the co-location industry.
So, Mike, when you write a history of this era, you'll look back and say, well, late 90s, 2000s, California, Texas, Northern Virginia, kind of making a transition here in around 2008, 2010. Why those locations and why here?
So a lot of it really revolves around where all the networks meet one another. The internet is a network of networks, and essentially people wanted their computers and their data centers to be in the places where they could connect to as many other networks as possible and get to all of the eyeballs. So that's why we saw data centers begin to pop up in places like Ashburn, Virginia, which is where we're sitting today, Silicon Valley, where there is a great sort of concentration of technology firms, and a number of large cities across the country all became data center hubs, and the business suffered during the dot-com bust. There were a lot of near-death experiences like the one that Equinix had, and companies like RagingWire that were privately held could kind of hang on and try to just white knuckle through it, and a lot of people did. But what I think we found is that the companies that built all of these data centers weren't wrong. They were just too early. It was too soon. And then, to me, the turning point in the internet and the data center industry, it was when Google came up with the whole, AdWords came up with the text ads that created a business model for all of the activity on the internet, and that until then hadn't really been profitable. That changed the internet from a sort of nonprofit operation into one that created a vibrant business ecosystem. And then that drove the need for people to do more of it and consume more of it. And then everybody needed servers and everybody needed a place to store them. And so that began a period of strong growth for the internet that really persisted all the way through the financial crisis of 2008 and has really led right up through the incredible boom in cloud computing that we're seeing today.
So, John, this is kind of a history lesson. So one of the great lines in history, in political history, from the Watergate era was follow the money, right? Everybody remembers follow the money. And I think Rich is spot on. When it comes to data centers, you follow the network. And that really was, what drove the whole data center industry. And you can, again, looking back at these generations, think about that early enterprise generation that I talked about. That was basically an IBM mainframe generation. There were all sorts of network protocols that were proprietary to IBM, and it was a private network running on all sorts of IBM equipment. What changed then in the middle, still following the network, is all of a sudden this internet protocol came out, the IP protocol. And I can still remember just being in the right place at the right time and going to hear a 22-year-old Mark Andreessen talk about something called Netscape and wondering if this thing was going to make a big difference, and just happened to be at the University of Minnesota at the time where there was a protocol called Gopher that kind of led into the internet. And so if you follow that network from that enterprise network into this internet protocol network, that's really then what got the data centers to where they are today.
When I look at those years, I look at what I consider the poster child for as a service, Salesforce. And this morning I went to Google Trends, I typed in Salesforce, and you see we're about 2008, that's the inflection point. And I'm sure with Andreessen, with many people, that's the inflection point where things grew and grew and grew. And it leads us to where we're at today, which is sitting in this fantastic facility here. It is like an architect's dream, I think. And we're in the number one data center market in the world, Ashburn, and right here in the RagingWire Data Center. Tell us about this place, Jim.
Well, it's not just this place. It's a lot of places that are here in Ashburn, Virginia, and RagingWire is really proud and pleased to be a part of it. And I think that's one of the big things that listeners might be interested in, is that it's no longer about a data center. It's about data center campuses, and we're right in the middle of a 78-acre data center campus. This is the first building that has been built on the campus, but it's massive. It's easily 250,000 square feet of space, enough power for thousands of homes, and that's just the first one of the data centers here. There'll be this is our VA3 data center, which of course implies that there's a VA1 and a VA2, but also kind of gives you a good idea that there's going to be a VA4, a VA5, a VA6, and VA7. And again, RagingWire is just one of the companies here in what's known as Data Center Alley, where 100 megawatt campus is not out of line anymore. And just a quick rule of thumb, if you were to get your arms around what a megawatt is, 1 megawatt is about 250 houses worth of power. So 100 megawatt campus is, about 25,000 houses worth of power. Did I do that math correct?
I think that math is right.
And I know that I grew up in a town about half that size. So just to give you an idea of just how much power is coming into these data centers, and they're powering all those servers that are running all those websites that we all use.
Rich, you're no stranger to the data center. I've been in a few data centers today. You probably have a few punch cards, like a frequent flyer punch card going to data centers. So give us general trends. And just looking out, we can look out the window here. There's cranes everywhere in Ashburn with data centers being built. Why here? Why Texas? Why the West Coast? I think you hinted at it earlier, talking about May East and May West and maybe telecommunication services. Does this reflect a trend of what's going on everywhere in the United States, or just these certain geographic locations?
We're seeing a couple of things with the data center industry as it grows and matures. Ashburn is sort of the center of the universe in the data center world. It's really the center of the cloud because cloud computing has become the driving force in the growth of technology in general and is becoming a platform upon which you're seeing many other technologies layered, artificial intelligence, virtual reality. We'll talk more about that in a minute, I think, but in terms of why stuff goes where it goes, Ashburn was one of the first places that became a network intersection, a meeting place for all of the companies that provide connectivity and knit the network together. And that is really something that has become more and more powerful over time, because it has a sort of gravity to it that attracts other networks. You want to go where all the networks already are. So it really has a sort of compounding effect with each new network or provider that locates here in Ashburn. It becomes more valuable. It becomes a more magnetic place for other data centers to want to come. So yeah, we see that here in Ashburn. The first thing I always do when I come down here to visit Data Center Alley is I drive around to look at all of the new construction, all of the new cranes. I was just doing that this morning, and there's always these massive new buildings that tell you how fast all of this is growing as people consume more and more technology. And that really guides where data centers get built. So there are these large markets that are very close to major business audiences. That's really the guiding force. Dallas, Chicago, Silicon Valley, Los Angeles, Atlanta is one that's being talked a lot about, Phoenix. The cloud services want to be close to where all the eyeballs are, because there's something called latency, which is how fast the bits are moving across the network and get it to you. We experience this when we're sitting home at our computer in how long it takes our favorite website to load. Or if you're a gamer, complaining about how fast the graphics are moving and where the lag is coming in. So that really has a lot to do with where the data centers go. And it's why over time we're going to see data centers in a lot more places. There's a new trend called edge computing, where we see more servers and infrastructure moving closer to the eyeballs. But Ashburn has always benefited from what we call the network effect. And it really has magnified over time, and it is just reaching an amazing scale.
And it's good for both the suppliers and the buyers of data centers, this network effect. So, if you're a supplier and you're here in Ashburn, Virginia, you're going to have access to the highest level of data center expertise that you'll probably find anywhere in the country, if not the world. If you're a buyer of data centers, you can be pretty confident that you're going to get a world-class data center at a really good price. It's kind of like having a gas station on a couple of corners at an intersection. Well, you don't have to worry about price anymore, because they're both going to be charging the same. What you look for then is this gas station a better fit for me than the other gas station? And here in Ashburn, we've got dozens of really good data center options for people.
So James, back in the late 90s, AOL was the initial occupant of a big facility down the road here. Was that the precipitant? You think that was the spark that led to Data Center Alley, or was it just a combination of things?
I think it was a combination of things, but that was definitely one of them, John. AOL being here. Now, a lot of the folks that might be listening to this podcast maybe don't even remember AOL. They don't remember getting those mailers, with the discs in them and signing up for your AOL. They don't understand the movie You've Got Mail. It doesn't even make make sense to them. But back in the day, AOL was a big deal, and it was right up the street here in Data Center Alley. And I would say it definitely was one of the catalysts, but it wasn't the only one. And it was really the combination of the fiber in the ground that came through the telecom era, those first early adopters like AOL. There was the available power that was reliable and pretty cost effective. There were skilled people, a lot of them former telecom folks that were now looking for their next job. And this area in Northern Virginia was one of the early ones to offer some incentives to data centers, to the customers of data centers, so that if you were to buy servers and put it in a data center, you didn't have to pay sales tax on those servers, and that was really a benefit. Mm-hmm. And it was all of those elements at the right time that really was the kind of the big bang, if you will, of data centers.
Rich, earlier you kind of, the big fancy word is intimated. Well, you talked about AI and you talked about artificial intelligence. Let's take and develop this a little more. Let's look to the future. And so what role is artificial intelligence going to play in these data centers? And especially, I think the word is automation as much as anything. So tell us a bit about where you see these data centers heading in the future.
So both artificial intelligence and automation are important trends in the data center industry. AI is really becoming a part of everything. Just about every major business is starting to take a look at how can we use the power of artificial intelligence to make everything that we do smarter. You know, we have smartphones, smart devices. Artificial intelligence uses the power of software to make the products and services that these companies offer a little smarter, more intuitive. And so what we're seeing is the large data center users like, you know, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple are all very focused and investing very heavily in artificial intelligence. So are data center companies who are using those same smart capabilities to manage their facilities better and to save energy, so they're using less electricity to power all of those servers and to handle changes in the weather better. So there's it's really having a dramatic impact. And one of the ways is that, you know, the hardware that's used for artificial intelligence is very powerful, and it's getting more powerful all the time. And so what we see then is that it throws off more heat and has to be cooled differently. And that has implications for data centers as well, because, you know, Google recently said it's actually going to use liquid cooling, water cooling to keep its servers cool in the data center, which requires some differences in how you build them and how you operate them. So AI, I think, is really going to be seen in more and more products and services. Just about every company beyond just these internet titans are thinking about how they're going to use this just to keep up, just to compete. And sometimes because they look at what they're doing and think, wow, this would be so much cooler if we could do this. And AI is often the answer to what the question is behind that this.
James, crystal ball, toss to you. Look at the future of data centers. Where are they heading?
Well, first, I think I'd like to put in a plug for the work that Rich is doing at Data Center Frontier, because if you're interested in the future of data centers, you're interested in the future technology, you can learn a lot about that at Data Center Frontier. Some of the best analysis and thinking that I've seen is when Rich digs into a topic at Data Center Frontier, I've probably read his article on autonomous vehicles maybe half a dozen times and learned something every time. So if you start thinking from the future of data centers and the real drivers, I think what Rich was going through are really kind of the application drivers. If you think about the future of data centers from a provider perspective, which is kind of the world that I live in, I think we're in a really exciting time. The industry is probably going to have one of the biggest years of its history this year in terms of consumed capacity, meaning our customers buying more data center space, more data center power, but also in terms of bringing new supply and making that available. And what's driving all of that is the cloud. And I think we're really experiencing, we're right in the middle of it right now, that probably this year, I kind of think of it in terms of an 80-20 kind of rule. And it's not exact math. We'll see what the numbers say at the end of the year. But I wouldn't be surprised if a large percentage of the data center capacity that is consumed and constructed is for the cloud companies, the large hyperscale cloud companies. And then the remaining percentage, whether it's 20, 30, 40%, that'll be consumed and built for those large enterprises and very specialized emerging applications.
One question I have for you, Rich, is this term you brought up earlier, edge. And I'm trying to think of, in terms of, yin and yang, and your biggest strength is your biggest weakness, and now we have these very powerful data centers. All of a sudden, the technology changes for IoT. We have sensors that are distributed geographically at different locations, and people are now talking about going to the edge. It's going back and forth, isn't it? So what's edge going to be the impact on data centers? Is it decentralization?
So it is decentralization. A lot of folks worry about whether edge competes with the sort of core data centers that we have here in Ashburn.
I would.
Well, the fact is that it doesn't. It's really additive. It's additional network capacity that we need. So what that's really about is that there are new applications that are going to require compute power all over the place. Jim mentioned autonomous driving, which is one of the best examples of that. Some of the new cars that are the self-driving cars that are being rolled out effectively have supercomputers in the trunk of the vehicle, because a lot of the operations of the car require compute power to make decisions, and those decisions have to be made in real time. They have to take place right away. You can't have any network latency while bits travel back and forth between wherever you're driving and here in Ashburn. So the technology on the car will handle that. And that, in a way, is an edge device, just as a smartphone might be. But the other thing about autonomous cars is they can get better over time. As the technology improves, the systems can learn and improve. And the only way that happens is if you take all the data that the car is collecting and can analyze it in greater depth. So what happens is when the car stops someplace, maybe when it's being charged, is it will offload data that can then be sent to edge data centers, which will then run some analytics on it and try and find out what's the valuable business information, what's the data from this trip that we can use to make this car run better and be safer in the future. They'll create a smaller data set, and then that gets sent across the network back here to Ashburn or someplace else, where you will have these sort of much larger databases that can then go and try to refine the algorithm and deploy it to all the cars that are out there. And so it's really an edge to core story. We need additional data center capacity and servers and computing power in all of these places. We're going to need networks in all of it. And a lot of this has to do with a new wireless technology known as 5G, which is going to be faster, have more capacity, and will spoil people because, everybody, we talked about the lag and everybody looking at the little hourglass or whatever. 5G is supposed to fix that. It's going to be expensive and take a while to roll out. And a lot of the antennas and things that are going to support this are going to be out by these edge data centers, because anywhere you're going to want to drive with that autonomous car, you're going to have a wireless connection and some compute capacity to make all of that work.
James, final question for you here. You talked about cloud computing and RagingWire being a service that, if you're a company and considering moving to the cloud, I don't think it's a binary or a black and white decision. You don't either move everything or nothing. It could be a hybrid environment where in the future we're going to see more and more companies taking advantage of the economies of scale that RagingWire can provide. And I see this term hybrid being used more and more, don't you?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, John. Is that it's not an either or equation for IT professionals, technology professionals. It's really it's a hybrid. It's a combination. It's a combination of the best technologies in the right locations for them to drive the IT systems that make their business work. And I mean, I truly believe that we are living in historic times right now from a technology perspective, and where this all heads in the next 3 to 5 years is just going to be fascinating to be a part of, and also to watch.
Well, you've been a part of the initial podcast from Raging Wire, and unfortunately, you're running out of time here. Stay tuned for more episodes. We'll be talking about energy consumption and cooling and water usage and disaster recovery, and maybe about edge computing, its impact on data centers, all kinds of different topics in the future. If you like this podcast, go to iTunes and like it and give us a review, and thanks for listening.